Merry Christmas, written by USA Today bestselling author Lexy Timms, copyright 2023 by Lexy Timms, narrated by Kathleen Starr Hall. Chapter 13, December 13th. Blair was double-checking the rough draft of the contract on her laptop when Coulson barged into the shop. Even though she couldn't actually see him behind the boxes he was holding, she could tell from his swagger that it was him, not to mention the familiar scent of his aftershave. That mint and pine fragrance that awakened her senses and drove her a little wild. "Where do you want these?" he asked, without even bothering to announce himself. His sudden arrival should have annoyed her, but it didn't. After a workday spent working on the contract, she felt slightly giddy seeing him in the shop, especially because she hadn't planned on going to the mansion this evening due to prior commitments. Seeing him here felt like a surprise, wonderfully unexpected, yet totally welcome. "It depends. What's in the boxes?" "Some information about the furniture in the house," he said. "Paperwork, old newspapers, letters of authentication, boring stuff I found in my great-grandmother's study." "Boring? Coulson, that's the most interesting part of the whole process." She rushed from the counter to grab one of the boxes from him, then jerked her head, silently indicating that he should follow her. She moved through the shop to her tiny office in the back where they stacked the boxes against one of the cabinets. Blair couldn't wait to get through all the paperwork. That was the fun part about dealing with antiques, those little tidbits of historical details that made each item unique and special. "Sorry to drop by without warning," he said when they emerged from her office. "The meeting with Opal's lawyer ran late, so I never got the chance to text you a heads up about the stuff I found. Thought I'd take a chance to just stop by the store. Glad to have found you." Oh, that last sentence made her go all warm inside. A dangerous development considering that she'd been trying her best to suppress her feelings for him. But how could she do that when he said the most incredible things to her? "Any influence from you, Blair, will likely make a man better." Those were the words he'd used to compliment her last night. Nobody said things like that to her. Blair had been in such a state of shock and wonder over it that she'd hoped work and an evening apart would bring her back down to earth. Coulson's appearance had obliterated that hope. Not that she minded. She should have, but she didn't. Her heart was fluttering too much for her to care. "You were meeting with her lawyer. That must have been tough," she said, leading him back to the main room of the store. "Yeah, it was hard making final decisions on her behalf, but it needed to be done," he said. "I was lucky to even get a meeting this time of year on such short notice." Blair nodded. "Business can be slow as molasses during the holidays." "Tell me about it," he said, chuckling. "Is it closing time?" She paused to check her watch. "Just about. I was going over the contract one more time before sending it." "Great. Shoot me an email and I'll get the contract signed," he said. Her stomach tightened, anxiety flooding her as she went over to the counter to shut her laptop. Drawing up the contract made all this real. Not just her store acquiring the collection, but the money that would come from sales. $1,500,000. That was what she stood to make. More money than she knew what to do with. She'd tried to remain calm yesterday as she'd done the calculations in her head, and for the most part, she'd kept her composure. But it was an eye-popping amount of money on top of everything else that was going on in her life, namely her connection to Coulson. Even though he'd made it abundantly clear that they didn't stand a snowball's chance in hell, Blair's feelings wouldn't go away. It seemed as if the more she fought her attraction to him, the more she wanted him. Fighting her feelings just seemed to intensify them, mostly because she kept thinking of the reasons she liked him in order to shoot them down. Except trying to shoot them down didn't work at all. Coulson was funny, charming, even thoughtful at times when he wasn't being full of himself. Resisting him felt so futile. "Of course," she finally said. "That email should be in your inbox within the next couple of days." "Guess I'll get out of your way," he paused. "Unless you need help closing up shop." She heard the hope in his question. Coulson wasn't sticking around because he had an extreme interest in closing antique stores. It was obvious that he didn't want to leave just yet. A discovery that confused her in light of him insisting they keep their relationship professional. He'd explained that his family wouldn't approve of someone like her. Blair wasn't upper class and didn't come from the right background. The Bennetts were so snobbish that they looked down on new money. She could just imagine what a dynasty like that thought of someone with no money at all, which meant that Coulson was fully aware where this was headed. So why was he so interested in spending time with her when they had no chance together? Maybe it was for the same reason she wanted to spend time with him. Everything was better when he was around. She felt so alive in his presence. No matter how much he infuriated her, she felt giddy and happy and excited when they were together. Blair always felt like she was on the verge of something wonderful with him. And each time it happened, she just ended up wanting more. Whether it was a compliment that changed how she saw herself, or a kiss that she'd never forget. Blair wanted to spend every waking moment with Coulson. The one man she couldn't have. They couldn't be together, or perhaps that was why the yearning she felt was so unbearable at times. Her longing for him was turning into pain. A burning, feverish need that set her whole body on fire. And worst of all, she couldn't even blame it on the hormones because her period was over. Blair's feelings threatened to overwhelm her, so much so that she had to place her palm on the counter to steady herself and find her bearings again. Taking a deep breath, she finally said, "I could use some help closing up the shop." "Great," he smiled, looking so happy at the prospect of completing the mundane task that her heart melted. If it weren't for his family, for their class differences, they wouldn't have to reach for excuses to see each other. But then she glanced at the Christmas tree on the other side of the shop, remembering how they'd met almost 2 weeks ago. He'd insisted on helping her put that tree up, and her life hadn't been the same since. Though she hadn't realized it at the time, Coulson's arrival was a gift, and it wasn't right to be upset that the gift wouldn't be permanent. During the holidays, she was going to be grateful that she was getting any time with him at all. "How about we get a drink after we close up?" Coulson asked. Blair smiled inwardly, sliding her laptop into its case. "I would love to get a drink, but I've got plans." "Ah, so you're not coming to the mansion this evening?" he asked, in a deceptively casual tone. Blair wasn't fooled. She saw the disappointment flashing in his green eyes. Coulson looked positively crestfallen as his shoulders slumped. "No, I have a prior engagement, so I'll be in town for the evening." She grabbed her things and moved away from the counter to walk over to him. "More Christmas traditions?" he asked. "Yes, but you wouldn't be interested," she teased gently as an idea came to her. There was nothing wrong with inviting Coulson out tonight. After all, he was interested in learning about the town's Christmas traditions. They could always write this off as yet another business meeting. "You sure about that?" The truth was, she desperately wanted him to join her, but she couldn't let on. Couldn't make this too easy for him. "Coulson, it's freezing out there for one thing." He leaned closer to whisper into her ear, a move that made her tremble. She was tingly all over when he said the words. "Try me. I bet I'll love this tradition." She tilted her head back to look at him, unable to resist the opportunity to really look at his handsome face. His smile was so dazzling that it made her lightheaded, and soon she was nearly lost in those heart-stopping green eyes. "Fine, you talked me into it. I'll invite you," she said, returning his smile. "What exactly is the tradition anyway?" he pressed. Blair headed for the store exit, feeling a mischievous glee. Coulson had no idea what he'd just talked himself into. "You'll see," she said. "Caroling? Caroling," he sputtered. Blair's parked car practically shook from the force of his exasperated annoyance. Not that she was surprised by the size of him compared to her little car, nor was she surprised by his irritation. Coulson was so tall, he'd barely been able to extend his legs in the car. And now that they were at the corner of Holly Street and Ivy Lane, there was no escape for him. They'd left his car behind at the store, so for the moment, he was trapped. "Yes," Blair said calmly, "we're going caroling." "No, you're going caroling," he said firmly. "I'll just watch." She laughed. "That is against the rules. If you're going to go caroling with us, you have to sing." "No way. No freaking way." Coulson shook his head vigorously, his dark hair falling over his eyes. "Can you play an instrument?" she asked, already guessing the answer as she reached out to open her door. Within seconds, Coulson bolted out of the car and came around to hold the door open for her. Even when they were arguing, he wanted to be chivalrous. It was sweet, really. Arrogance aside, She had to admit that he did things that made him endearing. As if reading her thoughts, he stretched his arm to take her hand in his. He squeezed her hand, the sensation sending a thrill through her. There could be a fine line between Coulson's chivalry and her own desire. Neither of them had been wearing gloves in the car, so she felt the warmth of his calloused hand on her palm. That warmth traveled up her arm, sparks radiating through her entire body as he helped her step out of the car. When she stepped onto the sidewalk, she was grateful that he was still holding her hand. Otherwise, she would have tripped over her own feet. Touching Coulson was so intoxicating that even the briefest contact between their bodies made her head spin. "My mother forced me to take piano lessons when I was a kid," he said, reigniting their argument. "So I've got that going for me." The change from practically swooning over him to crashing back down to earth was so jarring, she took a second to catch her breath as they walked beneath the bright glow of the streetlights. "We can't push a giant piano around with us, so you're going to be singing," she said. "And if I don't know the words?" he demanded. Blair let out a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a scoff. Coulson Bennett was a captain of industry, rich, powerful, supremely confident. He was built like an athlete, and he had the ice skating skills to prove it. Not to mention, he could carry a tree like it weighed nothing. She seriously doubted that anything scared him, except the prospect of caroling. He seemed desperate to get out of participating. "They're Christmas carols. Everyone knows the words to at least one of them." She paused when she spotted the group of carolers gathered in front of the house at one end of Holly Street. "There are always extra lyric books anyway, so you can sing along with us." A couple of the carolers noticed her and eagerly waved her over. She waved back, then looped her arm around Coulson's, dragging him with her as she began to approach her friends. "Have I told you how much I hate public speaking?" he said on the way over. "This isn't public speaking," she said, keeping her voice low so the carolers wouldn't overhear. "Correct. This is public singing, which is worse. Much worse." "We'll all be singing, so you won't be doing it alone." It was chilly out, so she fished her gloves out of her handbag and slipped them on. "I can't sing," Coulson warned. "It's not about being the best singer. We're here to get into the holiday spirit together and raise a little money for the gift charity," she said. "None of us are professional singers anyway." He grumbled something under his breath, which sounded an awful lot like, "You'll be sorry," to her, but they were currently being pulled into the group huddle for hugs and warm greetings. Based on head count, Blair figured she was one of the last to arrive, just like it had been for the past several Christmases. The carolers were the usual familiar faces. Townspeople of various ages, each one bundled up in warm clothes, the kids practically swallowed up by parkas. Some carolers had brought their instruments, including one fifth-grader practicing on his harmonica, a teenager lugging around a Christmas drum, and a grandmother carrying a shiny handbell. Meanwhile, some of the adults had brought along warm drinks and snacks. "Blair, so glad you could make it," said Mary, the rosy-cheeked grandmother holding the bell. "You brought a friend." As if on cue, a buzz went through the crowd as the carolers whispered and elbowed each other while they all turned to stare at Coulson. Blair felt her face heat when she remembered that they'd been walking arm in arm. Coulson pulled his arm away from her as if he didn't want to be caught out. But then, instead of moving away, he wrapped his muscular arm around her waist, drawing her even closer. Blair stifled a gasp. For whatever reason, Coulson seemed to want to silently claim her in front of everyone, which was ill-advised in light of his father's disapproval. Common sense told her that they were basically fueling a rumor mill that she hadn't anticipated. But the weight of his arm around her made her feel so protected. Her blush deepened, Blair's face now on fire. The whispers intensified. She was aware of how quickly the gossip was going to spread. Mislin Bush was like any small town. Locals talked. The barest hint that there was a potential new couple in town would have the nosiest neighbors gossiping for weeks. Blair desperately wanted to set the record straight and explain that they definitely were not a couple, but suddenly blurting out a denial was only going to make the situation even more awkward. Yes, this is my friend Coulson," Blair explained. "Coulson is Opal Bennett's great-grandson." Chatter grew louder. Looked like they had all figured out that he was one of the famous Bennetts. That makes you a descendant of the town founders, Mary said excitedly. How wonderful of you to join us. You know, I adored your great-grandmother. She made the best Boston cream pies around. While Mary introduced herself and regaled him with stories about Opal, the group started to get ready. Some carolers sang a few practice notes while the kid with the snare drum got a steady beat going to keep them in time. During the warm-up, Blair made sure that Colson got a copy of the lyric book. Did you know that your great-grandmother used to go caroling with us when she was younger? Mary said to him. Colson suddenly looked interested. Really? Oh, yes. She was also the choir director back in the old days. The best charity fundraiser we ever had, let me tell you. Blair smiled to herself, glad that he'd found someone to share memories with. This was why she had brought him. Sure, she had conned him into doing this partially to make him sweat. She had also done it because making friends and connecting with people were what made small-town holidays so special. Colson might have been from out of town, but in joining the carolers for an annual tradition, he was no longer a stranger. Too bad they'd sent the rumor mill into overdrive. Blair was going to have to weather that storm somehow. Hopefully, the town gossips wouldn't get too carried away. Finally, with Blair looping her arm through Colson's again, they all gathered around the first house to sing the first song of the night. After a few notes from the harmonica, the occupants inside opened the front door to greet them. A family of 2 smiling parents, 3 excitable kids, and their dogs stood in the doorway to sing along. Blair didn't need the lyric book as she sang. Anybody who had celebrated Christmas knew the words by heart, but she stole a glance over at Colson to see if he was keeping up. He was humming along. She supposed that was better than not participating. Plus, he was shoving the lyric book into the back pocket of his jeans. All that panic over nothing, she thought to herself, when she saw that he didn't need the book, just like she'd predicted. By the second verse, they were all singing loudly with gusto. An off-key note made Blair jerk her head back to look at Colson. He was actually singing this time. Badly. Honestly, calling it bad was generous. It sounded like a bear fighting off another bear. She stared at him, completely forgetting that she was supposed to be singing. Colson's eyes were closed, and he was really getting into it. He had a deep baritone that a lot of singers would envy, but he was so completely tone-deaf that it didn't help matters. Some of the other carolers paused to stare at him while they sang, sheer amazement on their faces as they realized what was happening. Finally, the song was over. The family applauded heartily and sent the carolers on their way with a donation for the town's annual toy drive. The carolers already bought most of the toys they'd planned on giving out to low-income families in the area. But Blair knew this last push would help with last-minute gift cards. The toy charity was a yearly tradition in town, and she always took part in any way she could. Caroling had been one of the ways she tried to give back each year. No child in Mislin Bush or the surrounding towns was going to miss out on the holidays. They headed down the block to the next house and then kept going down the street. Colson's singing didn't improve one iota, but their audience was too polite to complain. Later, when they finally made it to Mulberry Street, Colson shook her hand and asked, "So, how bad do you think I'm doing?" She liked the feeling of her hand in his so much that she didn't want him to let go, especially since it warmed her right up. Not just her hand, but her whole body. The whispers behind them didn't seem to matter anymore. All she wanted was for Colson to keep holding on to her. Best to keep the peace while they were walking hand in hand. Well, it's the effort that counts, she answered diplomatically, burying her head in his shoulder to keep from laughing. That bad, huh? He chuckled. Honestly, I decided to join in when Mary mentioned my great-grandmother. Didn't know she was the choir director back in the day. Thank goodness she had started laughing uncontrollably over his ear-splitting attempt at singing. Blair pulled her head back to squeeze his hand, leaning on him as he talked about Opal. This made it worth it. Colson might have had the worst singing voice she'd ever heard in her life, but when he spoke, she never wanted him to stop speaking. Seeing him connect with his family's history lifted her spirits so much that the rest of their trek down Mulberry Street felt warmer somehow. When they turned onto Cherrywood Lane, Blair smiled to herself. Home sweet home. You know, my apartment is just a few blocks away, she told him, walking with the group down the sidewalk. Maybe we could consider it another stop on our tour. Sounds good to me, Colson said. Her mouth fell open and she nearly tripped over her own feet when she realized what she'd done. She'd made the last comment without thinking. It had been so absent-minded on her part that she hadn't anticipated a response. There was no walking it back now, not with Coulson eagerly taking her up on her offer. Cherrywood Lane was the last street on their caroling route. Heading into her warm, cozy apartment with him was a tempting proposal, although there was a chance that the other carolers would be upset at her missing out on the usual walk to the local burger joint like they did every year after caroling. Her mind was a jumble of thoughts as they approached the next residence. Her companions might get the wrong idea about her heading home with Coulson, but they'd been gossiping about them all night anyway. Besides, she had promised to show him more of the town, and that was exactly what she'd been doing tonight. Stopping at her place was just a continuation of the tour. If anything, they could treat this detour like a much-needed break. Not to mention, they could always treat this like a business meeting. They could talk about the contract over warm drinks. There was nothing inappropriate about that. Coming to a decision, Blair waited for them to arrive outside her apartment before she told the group that she was going to head inside earlier than originally planned. "Oh, that's a shame," Mary said. "We were going to stop for burgers like always." "How about I donate to the charity drive to make up for our absence?" Coulson offered. Blair's eyes went wide because, knowing him, Coulson would be making a huge donation. Still, it was a kind gesture, and she didn't want to freak out over money in front of a crowd. She'd have to deal with that roller coaster of emotions on her own. And between her commission on the Bennett family antiques and Coulson's generous donations, she was going to need to accept that her ideas about money were going to have to change. At the very least, she'd have to accept that she'd definitely need an accountant in the coming year. "How generous," she said. "Thank you." "A toy drive is a great cause," he said, already digging to his pocket for his wallet. He soon retrieved stacks of cash and discreetly placed the money in the red envelope that Mary handed over to him. Mary stared at the fat envelope in amazement. "Blair, you're right. This is generous. Thank you so much, Mr. Bennett." "Coulson," he corrected, granting the older woman a smile and a pat on the back. "Think the donation could be made in my great-grandmother's name?" "Of course," Mary said. "She would be so proud of you." As the carolers huddled together to exclaim over the large envelope, Blair took Coulson's hand, put a finger to her lips, and began to lead him inside as quickly and quietly as possible. Best to sneak off before they got dragged into more conversation. The moment she stepped in through the front door, she flicked on the hallway light. "It's pretty small," she said apologetically as she weaved her way around decorations to get into the living room. In addition to the hanging advent calendar on the wall, there was the near life-size snowman figure that she just found too jolly to keep outdoors, porcelain bells, and the handmade paper snowflakes she created hanging from the ceiling. Plus, the tables were all adorned with festive candles, centerpieces, and pine cones she decorated with gold and silver glitter. "Don't worry about that," he said, following her. "The decorations look great." Grateful for the compliment, she went over to the Christmas tree in the living room, pausing to turn on the lights the way she always did when she got home. Some people thought multicolored lights were tacky, but Blair loved them. They made everything brighter and happier. All the bright colors reminded her of the tree lights that her parents had put up during her childhood. There was something so nostalgic about them, and now, for some reason, between the tree and current circumstances, she felt like a teenager again, sneaking off with her crush. Good thing she hadn't put up any mistletoe in her apartment. There was no risk of them getting carried away. Though Blair began to wonder where things might lead if she was a more reckless person. She knew that she had thought up a whole bunch of justifications for inviting him over, but even though she hated to admit it, the truth was, she'd cling to any excuse to have him at her place. Even if having him over meant she couldn't give in to temptation, Blair was too sensible for that. There was too much on the line to surrender to her desires. "Why don't you have a seat?" she offered, remembering her manners in the nick of time. "You can take off your jacket." "Thanks." Coulson sat down, his impossibly large frame making the sofa look tiny by comparison as he stretched out his legs. When he started taking off his jacket, Blair felt her face grow warm. A single look at his wide shoulders made her blush. This was bad. When was the last time she'd brought a guy over? 6 months? She'd neglected her love life so much that watching him take his jacket off was making her lightheaded. a feeling that only grew worse when he finally tossed the jacket aside, revealing the tight hoodie underneath that highlighted his muscular arms. Swallowing hard, she said, "I'll go get us some snacks." "Need help?" he asked, pushing the hood off to turn and face her. No, please, you're a guest," she said quickly. "And that's all you're going to be," she thought firmly to herself. "A guest. Nothing more." They were having a business meeting at her house, or was it a friendly tour? Either way, she was going to remain professional, no matter how badly she wanted him right now. Determined to resist him, she shrugged off her coat, then hurried to the kitchen to get refreshments.